coming. Welcome, my name is Zachary. I'm a librarian here at Northeast Harbor. Please take this opportunity to silence your phones if you haven't already. And while you do, I'll say that the library is able to offer free programs like this, thanks to the generosity of our donors, and thanks to our collaborators like the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. This is the first of 4 monthly history lectures we're presenting with the Historical Society. And for a full picture of the great work that they're doing, you can go to mdihistory.org after the presentation. And here at the library this Saturday, June 14th, we're giving away free sports gear at our annual swap event. So to hear more about that and all of our upcoming programs, you can sign up for our newsletter at the sign up by the door. Tonight's speaker earned his doctorate in history from the University of Maine in 2019, with research focused on the economic connections between the United States and the British Empire in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He currently stewards our local history as the collections manager of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. Please welcome Dr. Patrick Callaway.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming out. So as we go into this talk, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First, this is a bit of an unusual type of study. Usually historians are trying to explain why something happened or why it happened in the way that it did. We're coming at this from a different angle. We're trying to explain why something did not happen. We're very familiar with our island stories about Samuel de Champlain, about the very short-lived French mission post in 1613. We're very familiar with the adventures of the Soames and the Richardsons and other families as they come to the island in the 1760s. So what happened in that 150 years? Or more exactly, why didn't expansion happen during that time? So that is one of the questions that we are trying to answer here. The second thing that is in the background here is to note that we are talking about European settlement. We are talking about the contest of empires between the British, the French, for a short period of time, the Dutch, colonial settlers, Acadian populations. That is where we are focusing today, but remember that the background of this is a Native American presence that is on the island through the time period of this talk and persists to today. This is not a blank landscape that these various adventurers and various machinations are playing on, but rather it is a very intricate and very complicated interaction between Native American peoples and a host of other groups that have an influence on what does and does not happen. Okay. So this is a familiar map. This is the Samuel de Champlain map of his explorations in the 1700s. And this is part of our geography here. So you'll see what will become Nova Scotia, or the French colony of L'Acadie, the explorations down the coast through St. Croix, through MDI, through the Penobscot, all the way down to what is now called Cape Cod. These explorations are very well documented in his journals, which means that Europeans, especially the French, have a very clear idea of what is and is not here. They know that MDI exists. They know of the resources that are here, potentially timber, fishing, other resources that they might be able to gather. But their primary focus is not necessarily the land. The French Empire at this point in time is very interested in the fur trade. They are actively seeking contact with Native American groups in order to facilitate commerce in furs. So this gives them some influence on where they do and do not invest their time and their relatively slender resources in their colonial venture. Their primary focus is going to be on what is now called present-day Castine, what they called Pentagoet, what they called a variety and host of names, ranging from Bagaduce, Majabagaduce, and about 8 different spellings of it. The reason for that interest is geographic. being at the head of the Penobscot drainage is simply more valuable to them as a fur trading post than a settlement on MDI or further up the coast would be. That is one branch of what they're looking at. But there is a second branch that we will touch on in a moment that does see a relatively substantive agricultural settlements start to grow in the Bay of Fundy and through the western part of present-day Nova Scotia. So this gives us at least a good working knowledge of the landscape and what is possibly here. If it's there, people will start to fight over it. This is a reoccurring theme that we see in the 17th and 18th century. We see some inclinations to arguments over where the border should be, or if there should be a border all the way up to our present day. That's another speech entirely. But as we see even in the 16 teens and the familiar story that we have of Father Bayard and his mission, if it exists, somebody will fight over it. So 1613, we have that very short-lived settlement, which is burned to the ground by the English, who carry on to burn down the French post at Port Royal, what's present-day Western Nova Scotia. It's 1613, and that is just what they did at that time. This sets in place a familiar pattern that we will see for the next 150 years. There are potentially resources, but there is going to be a great deal of conflict over that resources. This leads us, one slide too far, to one of the more famous early maps of the coast, and this is the 1629 Samuel D. Champlain map. If you blow it out into full size, it stretches all the way from Hudson's Bay all the way out to Georges Bank with a relatively good degree of accuracy. This narrowed in part is interesting to us because it also lays out political claims and forts that the French claimed as part of their empire. As the background origin of the map was political, and a political conference over what the boundaries in this region should be. And if we blow in really close, you take a look at where present-day Castine is, you'll see a little fort and a flag, the flag of France, claiming that land as part of their empire. This claim has background. So this is Fort Panagoe, which is now the grounds of the Catholic Church in Castine. They did a number of archaeological expeditions there in the 1980s, and were able to trace out the old fort walls, the fort well, and other parts of the fort. This is Castine Harbor, as we're all familiar with, right at the head of the Penobscot, very lucrative fur trading territory. And here we have what is, in European terms, a very direct claim of sovereignty over the territory. Well, notice where our focus is going. Our focus for this fur trade is down in Castine, not MDI. But there is the economic rationale for why that is so, driven in part by economic interest, but also driven by geography. Now, this looks like a relatively substantive fort. By the end of this, you will get tired of seeing these old star fort maps. This is pretty much the ubiquitous model that you will see all over the place until the mid-1800s. But in reality, this is a fur trading post. It's a relatively small footprint. It is defensible to a degree, but this is not what we would call a substantive fort. In European terms, it would be a claim to sovereignty. In practical terms, this is a trading post. Well, if you build it, they will fight over it. We see a series of conflicts between the French, the English. There's a conflict between contending French groups over who had charter and right to the fur trading post. We even have the appearance of the Dutch for a period of time. In the 1670s, the Dutch take over for a couple of years. What the fur trade does is to attract not only an interaction between Native Americans and these French traders, oftentimes economic, but also familial. So we have an intermarriage between Native American peoples and these French fur traders and a small number of settlers in this area. but it also attracts a lot of unwanted attention because the geography makes sense for economic production. Well, when the place is changing hands politically over and over and over again, this tends to forestall wide-scale settlement because it is unclear who actually owns this in the European sense of title. To go back to how interesting the maps could be, the original western border of Virginia actually ends up somewhere out in British Columbia, if you follow the original land grants. Without a clear European title, and again, I'm emphasizing that European element of that, it is not very attractive for settlers. It is, however, very lucrative for the fur trade, which demanded a very different type of relationship with the landscape and with the Native Americans on the landscape. There is another thing to keep in mind. So this is a settlement map, 1700 or so, the settlement of the Acadiens. So there are immigrations that we see from the west and northwest of France during this time, so 17th century. They come from Western France, and they are agricultural for the main part, but they are used to conducting their agriculture in a very specific type of way and in a very specific type of landscape. They are looking for land that could be cleared, but they are very comfortable and familiar with working on marshland. So in the Bay of Fundy, as we know, the tides can range anywhere up to 40 feet. The land on the edges of the Bay of Fundy is very fertile. And they had the knowledge and the know-how to take advantage of those marshlands for agricultural production. What they did was come up with a series of dikes and sluices, which was able to desalt the flatland along the Bay of Fundy. That way they were able to put in agricultural crops, hay, livestock, corn, all of those sorts of things. But they needed a very specific geography for that to work. As we're familiar here with the island, there are not a whole lot of places that we would describe as a tidal salt marsh. Bass Harbor perhaps, maybe a couple of other spots. But as they are looking for places to settle, they are looking for a different type of landscape and environment. So they are looking at places that we see shaded here. So around what's now Grand Prairie, Port Royal, up at the head of the basin. So places like that, which more closely model where they are able to conduct agriculture that they are familiar to. So going back to our theme of trying to explain why something did not happen, this is one of the reasons. They found a landscape that they could use for their livelihoods, for their agriculture, for their society, that really was not matched on MDI in a substantive way. In European sense, title is still relatively conflicted. This will run into a number of wars, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but this is a little bit more of a settled type of environment. You notice on the map, Antigua is still there. There is still a French fur trading presence there that will persist into the early 1700s. The fort itself falls into disrepair, but we do have a very significant French fur trading presence there. One of the other problems that we have as historians is that we are captive to our sources. Taking a look at what did not happen runs us into a complication here. Because if we look at our map, if we look at our sources, we cannot say that there was a French or other European presence here on the island. However, let's look at this logically. We have a French fur trading post there, French settlement here and here. Is it possible, if not likely, that there were fur traders that came through this region, that there were people who perhaps had married into local Native American tribes, which did happen? We don't know. Those sources are just not as available to us as we would see through formal government documents or other resources that show European settlement in a more formal sense. So the lack of a formal settlement does not necessarily mean this place is completely off the map. It just means that as we look at the landscape, we cannot point to anything and say, somebody built a house here or started a fishing village here. It does not mean complete absence. Now you'll notice that we have been talking primarily about the French settlement, French explorers, French fur trading interests. The English did go back and forth with the French over Castile and that territory. And they have a very different colonial model focused on the land. So agricultural settlement. One of the downfalls of the Acadian settlement was that once you get past the initial rush in the 1630s and 40s, there is not a great deal of population increase after that, except for through natural increase. One of the laws in France was that you needed permission of the crown to immigrate. That permission was not really forthcoming by the time we get into the mid-17th century. British rules, well, at this point, English rules, really. Britain's not around until 1707 as a political entity. Their rules are a little bit more lax on who is allowed to leave, and in many cases, who is actively invited to leave. For us in this region, though, there are limitations. As you'll notice on our map here, this is 1689, very significant date, as this is the start of what will become later known as the French and Indian Wars. This one is particularly called King William's War. And you'll notice right up here, we have Pemaquid as an English settlement. That'll be removed in the 1690s, that will be captured and destroyed. But a little bit further on, in the region of Penobscot Bay, we have a denotation, English territory claimed, but not effectively settled. As we've touched on, claiming land and settling land are two entirely different things. As we see in King William's War, particularly the operations of a Native American chief by the name of Madakawando, and actually his son-in-law, the Baron de Castan, there is a military presence, an alliance of French and Native Americans that is able to roll the settlement frontier even further back. So Pemaquid, if you think about it, is not all that far up the coast. It's relatively close to Portland, which had been settled in the 1630s, but there is a line that the settlement does not continue. Well, this is another one of our explanations for why something did not happen. If we could come up with other reasons why we do not have an Acadian settlement here, this is a reason why we do not see an English settlement here, at least at this point in time. The geography perhaps was less forbidding for an English style of agrarian, fishing, lumbering economy, but the geopolitical framework was not there to put forward an effective claim to the land. Again, remember, the land is not empty. Native Americans are here present with allies, and that is going to be a direct control on what does or does not happen in this region. Our series of wars roll on. King William's War is ultimately undecisive. It really doesn't solve a whole lot in the framework of American or Canadian history. It was really an afterthought of the war that was going on in Europe. Nonetheless, we continue in the colonies to be caught up in European conflicts. Our next one up is Queen Anne's War. So as we get into the 1700s, we have another fight. So this, another star fort, I told you I love them. I warned you about this. This is Port Royal. So this was the primary settlement for the Acadian French. In theory, they were part of the colony of New France. In practice, they were relatively isolated from Quebec and were effectively governing themselves. They had extensive, if really illegal, trade connections with English colonies. Part of the research and excavations they did in not only Port Royal, but also in Castile, was the existence of tobacco pipe stems, which were distinctly English made. So in theory, under the law, that trade didn't exist. The evidence says something else. New Englanders are very interested in Port Royal, not necessarily because of the land or of agricultural settlement, but because of the fisheries. They see the French presence in what is now Nova Scotia as a potential threat to the English colonial economy. So the cod fisheries, other fisheries like that, this was supposed to be a place where, well, in New England terms, pirates, really privateers under the law, would stir up trouble for the fishing fleets. It was also a place where, allegedly, French agents would stir up trouble with Native Americans and encourage them to attack the frontier settlements of New England. There is a certain logic to it. There is a certain truth behind it, keeping in mind that Native Americans are oftentimes allies of the French. Conversely, there are also tribes that are allies of the English. To the New England eyes, Native tribes that ally with the English are good. Native tribes that ally with the French are bad. It's a pretty direct and stark way of looking at things, but they see Port Royal as the center of all of these problems. The Massachusetts government decides they are going to take this place out. They are going to go conquer Port Royal, not necessarily to annex it outright, but in order to forestall all of the potential problems that they see coming out of this region. To the surprise of pretty much everybody, the campaign actually works. Part of the problem with the isolation of the Acadian settlements was that they were not well defended. There's a small handful of French soldiers in the region, and when the English colonial army shows up, there is a siege. It's a relatively well-fortified spot, but the outcome is that New England troops take it over. Now this creates a major problem. On one hand, this is territory that has been captured. However, the disposition of property after a war is left in the hands of the crown. So the British crown and the French crown will negotiate territory over who gets what. So this is a reoccurring pattern. We'll see this again before and after. But the conclusion that the two crowns reach is that Nova Scotia will go over to the English. Well, what happens to the French settlements there? Undetermined. So they are in limbo, at least legally. There is an oath of allegiance that is required of them to the English crown. However, there is a great deal of dispute over what exactly that allegiance meant. Under British law at the time, you could not be Catholic and be a loyal subject of the crown. The Acadians were fervently Roman Catholic. This is a problem that is going to simmer for the next 40 years, which will eventually be resolved in a very brutal, direct way. But what to do with this colony remains the question. There is a refortification. This is rebuilt. If you go up there today, there's a reconstruction of Port Royal. That's there and run by Parks Canada. What does that mean for us on the island? Well, the one potential source of settlers, the French Acadian, now they're really off the table. What to do with them where they already exist is a question. Allowing the expansion of an Acadian settlement with, in British eyes at least, uncertain loyalties just is not going to happen. In theory, this should potentially open up MDI and the rest of the mid-coast and down east Maine open to settlement, but that is not what happens. Why? Well, there's other things going on as well. We move forward a little bit to the 1720s, what's called Governor Dummer's War or the Fourth Abenaki War. Two names, same thing. One of the real tension points to colonial expansion on the behalf of the English was not just the coastline, but rather what was happening inland in Maine as well. Again, there is a very strong Native American presence that is able to defend their lands, and there is an interest on the behalf of the French in facilitating that defense. To New England eyes, this is an absolute nightmare. This is an undeclared French war against New England. In their eyes, these Native American tribes are not independent, but rather they are proxies of the French. Is that entirely fair? Not even close. In the early 1700s, New England, they're one and the same. There's one particular guy who was perhaps the most despised man in all of New England, and that was Father Sebastian Rall. You also see Erasmus. You'll see a few variations of his spelling of his name, but he was a French Jesuit. So in New England eyes, being French is not good. Being Catholic is really not good. Being a Jesuit is even worse. This is about as close to the devil incarnate to the New England mind as you could get. And he's known to be associating with Native Americans, which, if that's the basement, that's where you start digging. He had a post at what's now present-day Norridge Walk, so not all that far from here. New England eyes, that is a French outpost. Well, was it really? Perhaps, perhaps not. There is a great deal of dispute over what the exact relationship between the French colonial government and the Native American tribes at Norridge Walk really was. What it was, for sure, was a French mission outpost. Again, remember Jesuits, missions, Native Americans, all of these things are not good to the New England eyes, and they see Father Rall as the source of problems in Maine. Why? Because if we take a look at our map, we get right around there. That's where we see Norridge Walk. Native American strongholds there really restrict how far up the rivers that they could expand. So what would happen if that threat was removed? Well, it would open up a great deal of mid-coast Maine. It opened up a lot of the river valleys. So the head of settlement of this time is right around present-day Richmond. This would open it up to Augusta, to Winslow, all the way up the drainage. That's a great idea. So they put a bounty out on Father Rall's head. There's something a little strange about putting a bounty out on a priest's head. In the early 1700s, this really didn't bother anybody in New England. They thought it was a great idea. They send out an expedition in 1723 and 24 with the explicit mission to destroy the Native American settlement and to kill Father Rall. The first time the New England militia shows up, word got around that they were coming, so everybody hid, which is a great idea. The second time, however, word did not spread quite as fast. Father Rall is, depending on your story, either captured and executed, is killed defending Native Americans who are trying to escape, or was killed as he was caught and trying to escape himself. All three things have been said in different sources. Especially in our primary sources, you get a very good idea of what New Englanders thought of Father Rall, both as a person and as a priest. One of the lithographs that show up in the New England press looks like this. So we have our figure here, Father Rall, being executed. There's no word if the Massachusetts government actually paid the bounty on his head. He was, after his death, scalped, and his scalp was taken to Boston as a trophy, and as we see, the village torched. The legacy of this is very difficult and complex. There is actually a movement, perhaps, to try to get him canonized. There is a very significant intellectual presence that says, well, this really is not a man to celebrate. It's a very difficult series of remembrances. For us, talking about MDI and settlement, this has a great effect on us. Why? Well, this opens up settlement all through those river valleys that were, in their eyes, threatened by this Native American village. So places like an Augusta, a Winslow, places like that are now open for settlement. Being on the river, that is potentially much more fertile land and easier to work. The lumber resources and communications are much easier. So this opens up other opportunities for potential settlers who potentially might have come up the coast, potentially might have come to MDI. This gives them another opportunity in a place that is perhaps a little bit easier to make a living. We'll skip forward just a little bit. It's not a star fort this time, so we're diversifying here. We're going to skip forward to the 1740s, particularly 1749, and the establishment of a British naval base at present-day Halifax. So it's an interesting map. This is Halifax as viewed from up the coast. This is the one place that we can point to in all of British colonial North American history where a city was established by direct action of the British government. The idea was that this would grow into an urban settlement that could support the British naval fleet, protect the fisheries, and provide a counterbalance for the remaining Acadian population that remained in the province of what is now called Nova Scotia. Well, there's a certain problem here. The guy running the place is Edward Cornwallis, and he has a very complex and complicated history. On one hand, he is a military man and an efficient administrator. On the other hand, his attitudes towards the Acadian and towards Native American peoples, he was pretty brutal, even by standards of the day. One of his more infamous orders was that there was a bounty put out on Native American scalps in the hopes of opening up more land for settlement. Again, an important man and a good man are not the same things. But what this does is create enormous economic opportunity. The first establishment of Halifax runs about 2,500 to 3,000 people, and it attracts business interests from all over New England. So merchant firms like Hancock out of Boston see a great opportunity here in the trade in things like foodstuffs, sugar, molasses, lumber, all sorts of different products where people could make good money being connected to this new urban settlement of Halifax. Well, what does that mean for us here on MDI? Again, this creates another opportunity elsewhere. If you are a merchant, if you have goods that you can sell, even if it is just firewood, you have a ready market available to you in Halifax that if you are trying to establish a farm somewhere up the coast, those economic opportunities are just not as prevalent. The other benefit to trading in Halifax is that this is going to be a place where you can get into the international trading economy. You can get into trade with the British, with the Caribbean, with Africa. So this is a significant opportunity that is available to people that settling on farms going up the rugged Maine coast perhaps just is not as attractive, at least not at this point. The Acadian remain, and our date here is significant, 1755. This is the start of what's called the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in Europe. Cornwallis suffered from very poor health. He leaves the colony relatively quickly. One of the other things that remains unresolved, however, is what to do with the Acadian. Because remember, they are French and Catholic in a place where being French and Catholicism is not really well respected in governmental circles. There are allegations that perhaps they are disloyal. And as we get into 1755 and the outbreak of war, Well, there are people who want to see these people removed. Now, ethnic cleansing is something we usually think about as a modern day term. It isn't. This is going to be a pretty good case study of it. For fans of Scottish history, this is coming right in the wake of the Highland clearances in 1746 and 47, after the collapse of Bonnie Prince Charlie's uprising. So removing populations who are of suspect loyalty because of political divide, language divide, confessional divide, this was part of policy at the time. We notice a continuity here of where we see Acadian settlement. So we see it, again, what's now the Annapolis Valley. We see it up at the head at Chignecto. This is the one that irritates the British to no end. There's a major French fort that is built in Louisbourg. So here, there is allegations, and there is some evidence to suggest that the allegation was grounded in truth, that these Acadian settlers were supplying the French garrison at Louisbourg with food. So we have another figure come, again, very controversial. This is Charles Lawrence. He's the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, another military man. Again, another very controversial figure in Canadian history. He strikes on the idea of removing the Acadian from the province, officially on military grounds and suspicions of disloyalty, on suspicions of associating and provoking Native Americans to fight against the crown. But there is another element to his thinking that he is perhaps a little bit less forthright about. And that is that if the Acadian are expelled from the province, that opens up the Acadian farmlands for settlement by somebody. Well, where do we find an expanding colonial frontier? New England. So remember that very close connection we see between Halifax and New England? Part of the machinations here is that if you remove one population from what is a very fertile and productive farmland, replace those populations with a more politically reliable group of people, it'll strengthen the province, it'll help bring more people to the province, it'll remove that problem. Everything's going to be great and happy. Well, setting aside all of the moral problems with everything I just said, there are some logistical difficulties. How do you convince thousands of people to leave a place where they have lived for generation after generation? This is also very rich land. There's a great series of portraits, 60s guy by the name of Picard. It's called the Deportation series. And this gives us an idea of what Acadia with the Acadienne looked like. So here we have a very typical, this would have been in the Grand Pré region. So we're very familiar with the red dikes. If you've been up there, that very heavy red clay soil, but very much an agrarian society. Now we see our hay production, we see our farms and haylofts in the back. So very pastoral, but very rich scene. We move forward a little bit. Lawrence calls an assembly, demands that the heads of all households appear in person before the crown. And the demand is that they swear loyalty to the crown of Great Britain with no reservations. Now, what exactly was promised and what exactly was threatened is shrouded in mystery. To Lawrence's eyes, their submission to the crown was insufficient. Now, was he looking for a realistic way of maintaining the Acadienne in the province? Probably not. He has some other ideas. Possibly this is him reaching a conclusion that he had already reached. But this leads us to a very dark scene. There is a replica of this church, if you happen to be in Grand Pré, another Parks Canada site. It's very well done. He calls in all the people, the heads of household, and informs them that they are going to be deported. Pretty much grab whatever you can grab, make sure your entire family's together, because you're leaving. How is this enforced? destruction. So burning of the barns, burning of the houses, burning of the crops. It is very important also here to note who is doing this, because it happens to be a couple of regiments of New England militia who are the hands behind this. And as you might imagine, if you are in a very rich agricultural place, you're thinking about opportunities after the war, you probably have a pretty good eye out for potential opportunities in this region, seen as it is now depopulated. Again, a very horrific series of events. The Acadians suffer very tragically from this, to say the least, but this does open up another opportunity. So the last of the series, we see the deportation, the human tragedy behind it, with people being rowed out on boats. About half of the people who are deported wind up dead. Shipwrecks, starvation, illness, so forth. A good chunk end up in Louisiana, which was a French colony at the time. A handful are scattered throughout the colonies. Some go back to France. Charles Lawrence really doesn't care where they go. Go is the operative word here. There's another case that breaks out in 1763, which is kind of interesting. There was a second attempted deportation. They sent a shipload of Acadian captives to Boston, and the town refused to let them land and sent them back. So this is an idea that is in circulation. Well, what does that mean for us here on the island? Well, this is another opportunity that opens up for potential settlers on the landscape. Because let's think about this. If you are in agricultural settlement, you have the choice of either A, going to this cleared land, which is very fertile, very rich land, or you can try to break a new farm out on the coast of Maine and go to MDI and places like that. Let's sweeten the pot a little bit. And this is a little hard to read, but this is an ad from the newspaper. Charles Lawrence, in addition to being a military man, is also a very entrepreneurial sort, and he is very much willing to use the resources of the province and of the crown to facilitate his goals of repopulating Nova Scotia with reliable English settlers. So he puts an ad in the Boston paper that says, if you come here, not only will English law, common law, be in place, there will be some incentives. There will be food provided. There will be land at a very cheap price. The quit rents, so basically taxes, will be kept very low. There's a promise that there will be infrastructure that will be built. Think of this as the offer of a very direct subsidy in order to encourage people to take over land, which is rich and, in their eyes, open for the taking anyway. Somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people from New England take him up on this. There's only a couple of minor legal problems here. He had promised some things that the Crown did not support. The promises of food and of survey were not promised. Whatever his many faults, he was a shameless promoter of the province. He was actually being investigated for fraud for making those promises and making payments to the settlers coming in. However, he dies before he is ever put on trial for anything. Well, that takes 6,000 to 8,000 people who were looking for places to settle off of the potential list for people who would move up the coast of Maine. It is simply a better deal. Better land, or at least easier land to work, and government subsidies in order to help your transport and to get established. The one thing they neglected to mention is that the land had been surveyed multiple times, and they spent the next 30, 40 years trying to get that sorted out. But that's not really important at the moment. So that takes another group of people out. So they set up what looks like a very common English type of government. So counties, towns, the infrastructure promises were never really upkept. But if you are one of those 6,000 or 8,000 people, you have a place now. So settlement will continue on through about 1763, 64, as more people will leave New England to go to Nova Scotia. Well, we still haven't gotten to how does this affect us on the island? Well, there's one more step in our process here. And this is where we start to transition out of trying to explain what does not happen into explaining what does. Because now we are 150 years down the road. So Champlain has come and gone. The French fur trade has come and gone. The French and Indian War is now over, and the French Empire in the New World is now gone. The Native Americans have been severely reduced. And this is a time when we have a very familiar figure in our island history come to the forefront. So this is Francis Bernard, a very familiar figure to us. One of the powers granted to a colonial governor is the ability to grant lands. And one of the grants that Bernard puts out is Mount Desert Island. So as we start to think about the Someses, the Richardsons, and all of them, this is where they start to get linked up. It is now a little bit safer to come up the coast. This is why, for example, if you go through Bucksport, if you go through MDI, you go through this region, you look at when towns are established, there's a lot of dates in the 1760s and early 70s, and this is part of the reason why. With the conclusion of the war, these land grants start to come out. There has been a very significant population boom in New England. There is a need to expand. Well, that leads us to one more question. Why come here? Why not go to New York or to Pennsylvania or to Virginia, where perhaps the climate is a little bit easier, the lands might be a little bit easier to work? Part of it is the desires of the people. So a fishing economy, lumbering economy. This is not necessarily a bad place. So thinking of ports and accessibility to the fisheries. The other reason is because it's illegal. So we see this old map, that red line that goes through there. Under imperial law in 1763, settlement to the west of that line was illegal. Now, it's illegal, doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it creates any number of legal difficulties for people who are trying to establish farmsteads and so forth on the other side of that proclamation line. You'll notice what is on the right side of the line, though. Where we are up here in New England, Mount Desert Island, through Maine, Nova Scotia, all of that is legal for settlement. So this is another inducement. So we have Bernard and others like him, the proprietors, offering potential for land. We have a legal sanction that encourages people to migrate to the frontier going north rather than west. We have economic opportunity in the forms of the fisheries and of the timber industry. We have the potential for the establishment of at least somewhat working farms and dairying and so forth. So now we transition 1762, what did happen? And here we re-enter a very familiar story to us that are fans of island history. Now, the development of Somersville, the incoming waves of migration from Massachusetts and Connecticut, and the establishment of a society that we see here on the island. This is, in many ways, a very different type of study. So we skipped through about 150 years of history, taking a look at a number of different groups of legal challenges and legal benefits that helped to shape action, how conflict helped to shape action and what people did or did not do, and the economic inducements for that. But at least in the way that is possible in the absence of sources and clear explanations, this gives us at least an idea of possible reasons why we have that gap from 1613 and that first settlement, short-lived as it was, and our familiar story from the 1760s and the establishment of the communities that we are familiar with. So thank you. Sorry, I'm under caffeinated.
Are you taking questions?
Mhm.
So why was settlement illegal on the other side of that red line? What was the rationale?
Why is settlement illegal to the west of that proclamation line? One of the things that comes out of the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War is that the British Empire is badly overextended, especially financially. There were numerous Native American tribes that still lived in that region, and the British did not want to have another Native American war. Well, one of the main irritants was illegal settlement in Native American lands. This was an effort by the government to try to forestall that conflict by placing restrictions on settlement. It didn't work. We have Pontiac's uprising, and there's a war whether they wanted it or not. This also creates a lot of bitterness with Americans who already had land claims on the other side of that line. So many of the elites that we will see in the Revolution, figures like a Washington, Jefferson, and so forth, had land claims on the other side of that line. So it's illegal. From the British perspective, this makes sense. There's another inducement that this could help stimulate and keep the fur trade in place, which was relatively lucrative. Settlers running around, that really doesn't help the tax base. It really doesn't do anything for the imperial government, so they wanted to stop that. Yes.
So Callaway turns up on MDI in 1688. So there is a presence of a French person there, and then he gets a claim from the king for MDI and surrounding mainland. So was that like attack from British, the proximity of the British that caused him to move along? Or why did he abandon his possession there and move to Detroit?
Yep. So good question. Why did Cadillac not hang on here? In part, it was the difficulty of trying to establish an economically viable colony with minimal people, so that wasn't there. The second was that he was a soldier, and he ends up ordered out to Detroit relatively soon after, so he has his eyes in other places as well. Yes?
It's not a question, it's an observation. I live in Nova Scotia half the year. I've been there for 22 years. I'm heard, but there's still an awful lot of French surnames up there among my neighbors. I live just 45 minutes south of Halifax. It's interesting.
Yes.
So they can all get thrown out.
Yes, so there is still, how and why is there still a significant French presence? Deportation is a lot harder than it looks. That's part of it. A lot of people, they were able to escape the net. A little bit later, by the time we get into the mid-1760s, our planter settlements from New England had run into a problem. Remember all of the diking and the infrastructure required to have those marshland farming. They didn't know how to run that system. They deported or tried to run off all the people who did. So in 1765, 66, we see an encouragement for French, the Acadian, to come back so they could teach them how to run the diking system and all that, because the farming was not productive without that infrastructure. So yeah, there was later events.
Thank you.
The trading post or in Castine, was that, I've seen the one Louisville and Lewisburg in Nova Scotia. No, they're not, that was comparable, was it? I mean, was that the stockade one, or was that made out of masonry?
Okay, so what was the fort in Castine constructed out of, and how does it compare to Louisburg? They're the same thing in terms of it was a fortified position, but they are completely different. Scopes, sizes, construction, they're about as far apart as you can imagine. The Castine fort was mostly, to characterize it, it was a stockaded trading post. What's built in Louisburg is a full-scale European-style fortress. So it has all of the best technology of the early 1700s with all of the bastions, with the artillery batteries, with the batteries outlaying and everything else. It is designed for war in addition to trade, but it is primarily a post of war. The reconstruction they have there now, which is very well done, it's about a fifth scale of what the original fort looked like. So an absolutely massive European fortress, as opposed to a more frontier style of fortification. Yes, if you have not been to Louisburg, Parks Canada has done an amazing job with that.
They made a lot of movies there. It is special.
Yeah, they made a lot of movies there. I have all sorts of vacation pictures from there, because I went up there in Wolf's Cove and the whole bit, so much history through there. I just try to be nice to the interpreter, because I might have broken one of their poor interpreters. Historians make absolutely terrible tour members. Poor kid. Yes.
So you were talking about the fur trading that was going on. My understanding was that right along the coast, Native Americans coming in contact with Europeans were dying off pretty rapidly because of exposure to European diseases. And so that oftentimes that shoreline population kind of decimated, whereas the inland folks were still okay. Did that affect the fur trading? Like, for how long was the fur trading going on in Castine? And how much information is known about what Native Americans, how many Native Americans were still coming to MDI?
Okay, so what is the state of the Native American populations? Certainly, there is a significant loss due to disease. If we take a look at the period from 1616 to 1619, there's a mass outbreak of smallpox, which just decimates New England Native American communities. Being inland is not necessarily a protection, because remember, the trading routes are pretty extensive and are not just coast inward, but also are coming up through New England and the rivers there, coming down through the St. Lawrence from Quebec and south through there. So distance is not necessarily any protection. I would hesitate to put my neck out and give any particular numbers. I just do not know. I would hope that there's sources for that, but I would defer to somebody that studied that much more extensively than I have.
Just make another comment about the Louis Border Fortress. That entire area of Cape Breton Island up there is just gorgeous. If you want to do a vacation, go up there. It's splendid.
Yes, it is beautiful. I'm hoping that they actually get the lighthouse fixed. As last time I was up there, they were still trying to get that sorted out.
There's a lot of trouble with lighthouses in Nova Scotia. A lot of lighthouses.
But it is quite the trip.
Yeah.
And, well, a little known fact that I ran into, it's about 30 degrees cooler in Louisburg than it is in Sydney. When I was up there, it was about 90 in Sydney and 60 in Louisburg. And yeah, wouldn't you know, I just found a reason to spend the day in Louisburg. But a lot of these places mentioned, as we talk about Grand Pré, places like that, they're still there on the landscape. So the Great Dyke in Grand Pré is still there, and it's a UNESCO site these days. So you can still see the evidence on the landscape of where a lot of this took place. Any questions online or?
No questions online.
All right, anyone?